As you make your decision around how to address long-term care, it's important to keep in mind some of the statistics around long-term care as you fit it into your own plan. This article is published on gilbertwealth.com and reviews some of the statistics that I've come across that are published by credible sources around long-term care events. As we go through this article, we're going to address four things. One is, how likely are you to have a long-term care event? The second is, when will that long-term care event most likely happen? Third is, how long that event might go for? And fourth, how much will it cost? So before I get into the article, I just wanted to stress that you are not a statistic. While these statistics are informative, your own long-term care event will be influenced by your personal health situation, your family history, and your supportive networks. So what is long-term care? Just at a high level, long-term care in most of these studies is defined as requiring help for 2 out of 6 what they call activities of daily living. Those are toileting, bathing, dressing, feeding, transferring, and mobility. There are additional activities of daily living called instrumental activities of daily living, but we focus on the 2 out of 6 because these are typically what long-term care insurance policies use in order to provide benefits to you as a trigger mechanism. So first, how likely are you to need long-term care? So there are a number of different studies around this, and most come in around 50 to 70% of those turning 65 will have some sort of long-term care need. Now, it's important to stress that some sort of long-term care need means that that could be a very long need or a very short or no need. It could just be one activity of daily living, or it could be multiple. There's a wide range of spectrum within that. Joe Tomlinson is another financial advisor in the planning community who provided this really helpful chart that shows a summary of the different studies that are out there. On the left-hand side, you can see a summary of any long-term care event, which again is from 1 day to longer. And the studies vary quite widely, with the most noted statistic out there that I see, which is 70% have any long-term care, but there are multiple studies that show around 50% of that. Now, it's important to note that the inverse of that is 50% don't have it, or 30% don't have any long-term care needs, as an opposite of this. And then within this chart, it also summarizes, which we'll talk about later, about how long people use long-term care needs, and it ranges but goes down quite significantly as you go out into from 1 year down the line. So when will you need long-term care? The short answer is most likely after age 80 is when most people go into long-term care. The average age upon entering a nursing home facility was 83, with 50% of people entering long-term nursing home facility after the age of 85. There are two charts here. One is from the American Association for Long-Term Care Insurance, which breaks down by age group. Only about 4.5% of people who enter a nursing home facility or have claims are 70 or under, with the majority of those then falling 81 to 85, 86 to 90, and 91 and over. So while you can certainly have a long-term care claim before age 80, the odds are much lower. This is another chart provided by the Society of Actuaries, which shows a distribution, and what you want to focus on are the bars here, of the number of claims for long-term care insurance models. And you can see kind of the wave happening as it increases and crests around age 80, and then drops kind of later into as we approach 100. Of course, most long-term care does end in death when you get into those older ages. We're not talking about disability long-term care. We're talking about older age long-term care. Does usually end in death there. So how long will it happen? Well, interestingly, most long-term care events ended up needing it for less than a year. So the average number of years or months for paid care is 9.6 months, with 54% of the total population turning 65 not using any long-term care. And then 25% of the total population received less than 1 year on top of that. So 54% did not use any. 25% were less than a year, so almost 75% of that had either no or less than a year. Focusing on nursing home stays, which we'll talk about some of the expenses later, but nursing home being the most costly form of long-term care out there. The average stay in terms of months was 13 to 14 months in a nursing home facility, but the median stay, which not to get too technical, looks at the midpoint of all stays ranked. The median stay was around 5 to 6 months. And so 50% of people will be around 5 to 6 months within a nursing home facility. I do have an article on what is the difference between mean and median. It is a very important concept when you're thinking about these sort of things. But the majority of people will be around that 5 to 6 months to a year. And you could go out to about 20 months and capture the majority of cases. Marriage status does influence the length of stay. Where on average unmarried individuals had an average of 3 to 4 months longer in long-term care nursing home facility than married couples. High net worth had shorter stays, likely due to their ability to pay for home health care. And then this chart I found is very interesting. It breaks down the length of stay in months in nursing home facilities. And you can see there's a huge number that go in for just 1 to 2 months. And you can see the 6-month mark here, where the majority of cases are to the left of this, of 0 to 6 months. There are certainly cases where people have stayed much longer. My grandpa was in a nursing home facility for 2 years, so 24 months. So he fell in out here, whereas my grandma was much shorter. So every scenario ranges, but there is certainly a large distribution of cases that fall in the 0 to 6 months. Finally, how much will long-term care cost? Of course, it really depends on how long you stay and what type of care you need. There's a wide variety, which I'll cover at another time, but most people will have fewer than $100,000 in expenses. But for those who do need care, they could potentially need a lot of it. As we think back to some of the previous charts, where 50% of people don't even have long-term care expenses. And they would obviously fall well below $100,000. But then the other 45% that do will have larger expenses. So most will have fewer than 100,000. Genworth, I did provide this calculator for you. Genworth does provide a very interesting calculator where you can put in where you live, and it'll give you a breakdown between the different types of care and how much that costs on a daily, monthly, or annual basis for your area. So I'd highly recommend you take a look at that. It also gives a forward-looking projection of what costs are or are projected to be. But this chart here is really quite fascinating. This gives you your estimated long-term care expenditures for folks starting at age 65 in the future. And what you can see here is 50% won't have any long-term care costs. And then it breaks down in different expense buckets how many people fall into that. So on top of that 50 who have zero, the next 8% will have less than 10,000. They have a very short period, very short stay in long-term care. And as you go up, this column over here, kind of in the middle, reaches 100,000. And this is where I say, 25%, which is the sum of these first few columns, will have less than $100,000 of long-term care expenses. There will be a few that have between 100,000 and 250,000. But then why I say those who might potentially need the care will really need it is because of this last column. This last column just groups together those who need 250,000 and more in long-term care costs and need. And it's almost 15% of the population will need more than 250,000 in costs. So there's a big grouping, either people who don't need or don't have a big need for long-term care, and those who really need it. And that's what makes long-term care such a difficult decision, because you don't know which branch you're going to fall into. But it's important to keep that in mind. A few other statistics that I have in here. Your sex at birth does have a big impact on how much care you'll need. Women have a much more likelihood to use long-term care because they have longer life expectancies. Typically, they are also younger in a marriage, and so if their spouse dies earlier than them, then they don't have anyone to help them through some of those early years of long-term care where they might need be able to stay at home if they had somebody to help them along. Most long-term care claims are for home health care. 45% of claims are for home health care, 31% are for assisted living, and 17% are just for nursing home facilities. And finally, the most needed services, when you think back to those activities of daily living, bathing and dressing were the highest. 90% of people going on claim needed help with bathing. 88% needed help with dressing. For the independent activities of daily living, preparing food, housework, transportation, taking medications were some of the highest needs. I hope this was helpful in thinking through your own long-term care needs and how to address that. Keep in mind again that these are just statistics across everyone in the U.S. in a variety of different situations. So it's important to keep this in mind, but we also need to look at your own specific situation and how you would like to address that.